The past is never dead, William Faulkner, the American novelist, once said. It's not even past. To understand why 1989 turned out the way it has, we need to go back in this ever-present past a number of decades, all the way back, in fact, to the Soviet nationalities policies of the 1920s. As much as American conservatives like to talk about captive nations in the Soviet Union, Soviet policy was in fact initially highly egalitarian. It was based on a principle known as Korenization, or indigenization, in which hitherto oppressed ethnic groups were granted their own territories, a high degree of cultural and linguistic autonomy, and in some cases their first written languages. Where the czars recognized only one nationality, Russia, the 1926 Soviet census listed 176 nationalities, a list that was eventually pared to 69 in some 16 republics and dozens of autonomous regions. Korenization appears to have been highly successful. Ethnic and linguistic minorities got their own schools, their own press, their own political representatives, and they seem to have responded enthusiastically. Indeed, it is interesting to note that Ukrainian nationalism actually leaned in a pro-Soviet direction in the 1920s at a time when Poland was had a policy of enforced polonization in its eastern reaches, which were very heavily Ukrainian. And that various communist front groups did especially well in the 1928 elections, especially in the Ukrainian-dominated province of Volhynia. It's a glimpse into the world as it might have been. But Korenization fell by the wayside during the collectivization campaigns and was officially jettisoned in 1937 during the Stalinist terror. This was ironic because Stalin himself, of course, was a non-Russian. He was a Georgian, but also was the first Soviet minister of nationalities and therefore an important architect of this policy. But Russian nationalism was now on top, and egalitarianism was now downgraded. But even at its worst, however, Soviet nationality policies never approached that of the czars. Russia was preeminent, and Russia and Soviet patriotism were essentially seen as synonymous, but there was still room for other nationalities beneath this Russian-Soviet canopy. And this kind of Soviet/Russian patriotism probably reached its peak during World War II. The Soviet leadership was unprepared politically for the Nazi invasion in 1941 as it was militarily. The old methods of terror and coercion obviously would not work now that a major portion of the Soviet population was behind German lines and therefore out of the reach of the NKVD. So the Soviets had to relearn the arts of political mobilization, political appeals, political motivation. And the people behind German lines were undoubtedly skeptical because their experiences, many of their experiences with Soviet rule were extremely unpleasant. But there's little doubt that the appeals did work eventually, if only because the Nazi behavior towards these populations was so bestial. In fact, one of the jokes that made the rounds in the Ukraine in the wartime Ukraine said, "What did Hitler accomplish in 20 years that Stalin couldn't accomplish in one?" And the answer is he made Soviet rule popular. And one result of this kind of Soviet patriotism and the positive response it engendered was a proliferating, burgeoning partisan movement, which became the biggest partisan movement of its type in all of occupied Europe. And the movement was marked by a very high degree of ethnic diversity and integration. For example, in the Pinsk area in Belarusia, 58% of the partisan forces were Belarusian, while 20% were Russian, 9% were Ukrainian, and 13% were other, mainly Poles and Jews. The Voroshilov partisan detachment included some 28 nationalities, including Georgians, Ossetians, Uzbeks, and Kazakhs. This is not the case of the other partisan forces, of which there was no shortage amid the chaos behind German lines. They were organized on a strictly national basis and consequently engaged in a series of debilitating wars for national control. To quote the historian Kenneth Slepian, the American historian, the Holocaust was but one example of mass ethnic killing in World War II. Indeed, much of the borderlands region encompassing the Baltic states and present-day Western Belarus and Ukraine became a site of widespread, horrendous violence as Balt, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Poles, and indigenous Germans claimed territories in which these groups had intermingled for centuries. In the spring of 1943, for example, Stepan Bandera's Ukrainian insurgent army launched a massive ethnic cleansing operation in Volhynia and nearby areas with the goal of driving out the Polish population. An estimated 100,000 Poles were killed and 500,000 others were sent fleeing, whereupon the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, or AK, slaughtered as many as 20,000 Ukrainians in retaliation. The AK also attacked Belarusians, killing some 1,200 in and around the city of Lida in late 1943, and engaged in a full-scale civil war with Lithuanian nationalist partisans in and around Vilnius and Navarudak. The Jews, of course, were the ultimate odd man out in this Hobbesian war of all against all. The right-wing complaint that Jews and Bolsheviks were one and the same had a certain grain of truth. After all, Jews had been overrepresented on the left since at least 1848, and where many, but not all, Poles and Balts saw the Soviet takeover in 1939 as a betrayal, many Jews saw it as the opposite, not as a stab in the back, but as liberation. They welcomed Sovietization, not only because it offered freedom from anti-Semitism, but because it offered freedom from Jewish social control, from the rabbis, from the communal councils, and from the religious schools, whose collective influence was stifling. To quote the historian Jan Gross, it was the perspective of emancipation from Jewishness, as much as emancipation of the Jews, that drew youngsters into the streets to cheer the Red Army on and later to work on behalf of the Soviet occupiers. But of course, Polish and Ukrainian nationalists, when they viewed Jews cheering on the Red Army, saw them as cheering on their own dismemberment and defeat. Less than 2 months after the Soviet takeover of Eastern Poland, for example, a local representative of the Polish government in exile in London reported, "Jews are so horribly persecuting Poles and everything else that is connected to Polishness under the Soviet partition that at the first opportunity, all the Poles here, from the elderly to the women and children, will take such horrible revenge on the Jews as no anti-Semite has ever imagined possible." Needless to say, Jews were not persecuting Poles, but their pro-Soviet attitudes were enough to indict them in Polish nationalist eyes. Never from Polish nationalist perspectives, had Jews seemed more of a national enemy. The experience of World War II, is one of those past that are with us still in Faulknerian terms. Another is that of perestroika, and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse was as much national as it was economic and political. The more the economy plummeted, the more the entire Soviet bloc tended to fragment along national lines. As the ruble plunged and stores grew bare, individual Soviet republics banned the export of food supplies across their national lines. Indeed, a prominent Democrat, small d, running for local office in Moscow even vowed to ban shoppers from other parts of the city from entering her own district. She was elected, by the way, in a landslide. Instead of a national economy, the Soviet Union was, quote, rapidly regressing to a pre-monetary, semi-feudal state of regional autarky, to quote an American neoconservative named Leon Aron. Like socialism itself, the principle of national equality had been betrayed 1,000 times over since the rise of Stalin, but the events of 1989 to 91 marked its final demise. With every last vestige of a Korenizatsia eradicated, a system of national self-determination in its most egotistical sense arose. The US had long pushed for a concept of national freedom and independence that would allow each Soviet republic to go its own way. But once they did so, the US then assured those republics that further fragmentation would not be tolerated. As a result, national boundaries were suddenly frozen in place. Under the Soviets, national boundaries had never been regarded as the last word, and in fact they were adjusted some 30 times between 1930 and 1970. But now they were fixed in stone, and as they were fixed in stone, minorities found themselves stranded in what was now someone else's house. Sorry. I knew this would happen. Sorry. Oh, yes, great. A series of vicious ethnic conflicts broke out amid the ensuing panic. In Azerbaijan in early 1988, Armenians in the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh demanded to be joined with the Armenian Republic a few kilometers away. In Georgia, demonstrations broke out against Russification and Azerbaijani, quote, colonization. In the Baltic states, anti-Russian demonstrations also broke out. By mid-1989, intense ethnic violence had spread to the Fergana Valley when fighting broke out between Uzbeks and Meshkitian Turks, to the Kazakh oil town of Novi Uzen when Kazakhs battled Lesgians, people from the Caucasus. And on the Black Sea, Abkhazians and Georgians fought one another with automatic weapons while vacationers scurried for cover. This fighting spread to Yugoslavia as well shortly later. And in fact, Slovenia, the first Yugoslav republic to declare independence, was following events very closely in the Soviet Union and modeled their independence movement on the Baltic independence movements of a year or so earlier. And in that case as well, the hardening of national boundaries was really the cause of the fratricidal conflict that erupted there, because people who had lived peacefully with relative comity in republics at a time when the boundaries were really unimportant were not afraid, they felt secure, but as soon as those boundaries hardened, then suddenly people panicked. And in Bosnia, for example, Serbs rose in revolt when the Bosniak Croatian majority began pushing for independence, leaving the Serbs feeling vulnerable and at risk. So whereas the NATO and the US preferred to blame Serbian stubbornness and violence, I think that really the key to understanding that crisis lies in the fundamental constitutional change that took place in 1989 to 91 and its disastrous effects on inter-ethnic relations. Liberals and social democrats on both sides of the divide had hoped that the end of the Cold War would usher in a period of liberation. Instead of one superpower replacing another superpower, it was hoped that there would be an end to power politics altogether, so that Europe could be able to remake itself along human lines. But it was not to be. Rather than peace, 1989 ushered in a period of renewed warfare. 1 month after the Berlin Wall fell, the U.S. celebrated by invading Panama, whose dictator, Manuel Noriega, was said to be working with the narco-traficantes. In 1991, it launched the first Gulf War. In October 1998, Bill Clinton signed the Iraq Liberation Act, committing the U.S. to the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. 5 months later, Clinton declared war on Serbia in response to intercommunal violence in Kosovo, and NATO warplanes flew some 38,000 sorties over Serbia in the course of a 10-week period. NATO's eastward expansion also commenced at this time, and such new members as Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Estonia, and Latvia all took part in the anti-Serbian offensive. And leading dissidents of the 1980s also played an important role in pumping up the new post-89 bellicosity. In 1993, for example, in response to the Yugoslav Civil War, Václav Havel formulated what's since been called the Havel Doctrine, the notion that the international community, which is to say the West, had a moral obligation to intervene in other countries whenever evil, whatever that might be, reared its head. Needless to say, this did not give Serbia the right to intervene in the United States in response to police brutality against African Americans. What it meant is that NATO now had a free hand to intervene in certain outlying republics that had long been in American crosshairs. Poland's Lech Walesa also became a leading spokesman for NATO expansion, and both he and Havel and Adam Michnik would later endorse the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. NATO expansion acquired an ominous new dimension amid growing friction with Russia. The problem actually started under Yeltsin, who had opposed NATO's assault on the remnants of the old Yugoslav Federation, and at one point he had threatened military action to prevent NATO from carving off Kosovo. But it unquestionably intensified under Putin. When Putin refused to back the invasion of Iraq, the Bush administration was furious, and neoconservatives in Washington responded by stepping up support for the Islamic fundamentalist rebels in Chechnya. In August 2008, conservative U.S. Senator John McCain encouraged Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili to launch his ill-fated war to take back the breakaway province of South Ossetia. But the Ukraine was the most important battleground of all. In his 1979 bestseller, The Grand Chessboard, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, advocated breaking up Russia into 3 separate pieces: a European Russia, a Siberian Russia, and a Far Eastern Russia. He also urged the U.S. to encourage a proliferation of small states to hem Russia in and check its power, and in particular, he called upon the U.S. to support a strong and independent, i.e. pro-Western, Ukraine, to provide further protection against a Russian resurgence. Quote, the consolidation of a sovereign Ukraine, which in the meantime redefines itself as a Central European state and engages in a closer integration with Central Europe, is a critically important component of such a policy, Brzezinski wrote. With more than 100 ethnic groups within its borders, Russia is highly vulnerable to any such strategy. But the Ukraine is vulnerable too. The deeper the Ukrainian economy sank following independence in 1991, the more evident it became that the country was fundamentally torn between a western portion that had been part of Poland prior to 1939 and a stronghold of Bandera during the war, and an eastern section until 1954 was part of the Russian SFSR, the Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, and was still pro-Russian in terms of political, cultural, and linguistic leanings. But NATO and the US had no compunctions when it came to championing the Banderaist groups in the West. But this required a further ideological adjustment. The Red Army had liberated the Ukraine and Eastern Europe in 1945, but the Cold War against the Soviet Union and the Neo-Cold War against post-Soviet Russia required that the events of 1944 to 45 be interpreted differently, not as liberation, but as renewed subjugation. No different in essence from the Nazi subjugation that preceded it, and in some ways even worse. The growth of influence of groups like the Home Army required a similar reorientation with regard to East European nationalism. Anti-Semitism, ethnic cleansing, collaboration with the Nazis, all these things had to be forgotten, cast by the wayside. Rather than compromised, groups like the AK, the Home Army, had to be portrayed as the real liberating force as opposed to the phony liberation of the Soviets. And Bandera and his forces, Bandera was too extreme for that kind of makeup, but nonetheless he had to be portrayed as somewhat less bad than he actually was. His reputation had to be softened. At least some historians played along. Previously, scholars had been portraying Stalinism and fascism in ways that were increasingly sophisticated and nuanced. The American historian Robert Paxton, for example, showed how it was not Germans who rounded up French Jews during the war, but French police and civil servants. And Jan Gross, in his celebrated 2001 expose, Neighbors, showed how ordinary Poles rose up to slaughter Jews in July 1941, not at the behest of the Germans, but entirely on their own initiative. The point simply was that fascism was not an exclusively German phenomenon, but an equal opportunity employer drawing in Poles, Ukrainians, Balts, and I might add even Jews into its wake. But the new political climate required a return to the self-aggrandizing black and white mythology of yesteryear. The culmination of this trend was a book by a Yale historian named Timothy Snyder. The book is entitled Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. Bloodlands made a mammoth splash when it was published in 2010. It was translated into 28 different languages. It was a bestseller in the US, Israel, Germany, Poland, and Latvia. It was lavishly praised in journals like The Guardian and the New York Review of Books, and it received numerous prestigious awards. But its thesis could not have been more reactionary or dangerous. Snyder advanced a very simple argument. Hitler and Stalin, he declared, were not only morally indistinguishable, but mutually reinforcing. They wreaked more havoc together than they ever would have separately. Since they were partners, he also argued that anti-fascism was a fraud, and that the Soviets who fought the Nazis were no better than the Nazis who fought the Soviets. Bloodlands also argued with regard to the Soviet partisans that they too were no better than the people they fought. As Snyder put it, quote, partisan warfare was and is illegal since it undermines the convention of uniformed armies directing violence against each other rather than against the surrounding populations. Its only purpose, therefore, was to make life even more miserable for ordinary civilians by contributing to, quote, an escalation of both German and Soviet violence. When Soviet partisans sabotaged trains, They were in effect ensuring that the population near the site would be exterminated. When they planted mines, they knew that some would detonate beneath the bodies of innocent Soviet civilians. Yet, according to Snyder, they didn't care. Their goal was to spread as much murder and mayhem as the Nazis did, if not more. Snyder's hostility to the partisans, his anti-fascism, we might call it, extended to the Jews who joined partisan ranks. We might think that Jews who escaped the Nazis and made their way into the woods where they were able to get arms and fight the invader, we might think those people were heroes. But according to Snyder, they were the opposite. Jews who joined the Soviet partisans, quote, were serving the Soviet regime and were taking part in a Soviet policy to bring down retribution upon civilians. Those who took up arms did so, quote, at the cost of partaking in the descent into mass violence. At the same time, and one gets the impression with regard to the Jews who joined the Soviet partisans, that Snyder thinks that they would have been better off if they'd stayed home and allowed themselves to be killed, because by fighting back, they only succeeded in making things worse. At the same time, Snyder's attitude towards the Polish, Baltic, and other nationalist armies during the war is broadly exculpatory. He writes that Lithuanian units that killed Jews did so, under German supervision and orders, thereby ignoring numerous incidents in which they killed Jews on their own initiative. He writes that the Nazi death squads known as the Einsatzgruppen organized the ferocious anti-Jewish pogrom in Lvov in July 1941, when in fact it was Bandera's organization of Ukrainian nationalists that took the lead. Despite his copious citations, he manages to omit any mention of Jan Gross's book Neighbors, with its very different message concerning local responsibility. Snyder is especially protective of the Polish Home Army. Most historians, for example, are appalled by the AK's refusal to aid the Jewish fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto, who in April 1943 rose up in a doomed, isolated, impossible, but absolutely heroic revolt against the Third Reich. But Snyder, remarkably enough, defends the arms boycott on the grounds that the ghetto fighters were fatally compromised by their pro-Soviet leanings. As he puts it in Bloodlands, the Jewish Combat Organization included, that was the main fighting force in the ghetto, included the communists who were following the Soviet line and believed that Poland should be subordinated to the Soviet Union. From the perspective of the Home Army, rule by the Soviets was little better than rule by the Nazis. There were hardly any circumstances that would seem to justify a Polish independence organization arming communists inside Poland. Despite these reservations, the Home Army did give the Jewish Combat Organization a few pistols in December 1942, when in fact, by the way, they had large, literally thousands of guns, machine guns, hidden away following the German invasion in 1939. Snyder also ignores the statement by Antique, the Home Army's anti-communist agency, in the summer of 1942, which declared, "Whether we like it or not, communism is attacking us. The extermination of the Jews in Europe by the Germans, which will be the final result of the German-Jewish war, represents from our point of view an undoubtedly favorable development, for it will weaken the explosive power of communism at the moment of the German collapse." Someone yesterday referred to the Historiker Streit, the German historians' quarrel in the 1980s, in which Ernst Nolte was roundly assailed for arguing that that Nazism was merely an exaggerated, but on the whole not unjustified response to Bolshevik terror. But Snyder was saying something remarkably similar to Nolte's thesis, and yet the response 30 years later or 20 years later was one of almost universal praise. So what happened in those ensuing 20 or 30 years that led to this really dramatic change in the intellectual climate. And I would argue it was really the national question, which is the key to understanding what happened. In the Soviet Union fell apart in Eastern Europe, freedom, independence, and desovietization were all regarded as synonymous. And of course, the Soviet legacy was cast off, and each East European country was free to go its own way. But of course, freedom in 1989 did not arrive unencumbered. It was associated with free markets, undercutting of welfare, and growing nationalism. The results in the 1990s, people tended to believe that the nationalist fires were still largely confined to the Balkans, where they were burning themselves out. Let me just finish it as fast as I can. But we know that that's not the case, because since the 1990s, nationalism has spread much wider, and it seems to be accelerating in the wake of the friction with the Russians. And really, that's all I have to say. We see the results are all around us: an increasingly poisonous nationalist climate throughout Eastern Europe, growing alarms over the alleged Russian threat, remilitarization, an increasingly bellicose U.S. attitude towards Russia, and an arming of the East European regimes, and what seems to be a steady buildup, and of course civil war in the Ukraine, and what seems to be a steady buildup in hostilities, and no foreseeable way that those hostilities can be reduced. So it's hard not to be pessimistic in the short and mid-term, where those hostilities can only seem to be increased, due, I would argue, to the unleashing of nationalist passions since 1989 and the overthrow of any kind of a hope of an equitable solution to the nationalities issue in Eastern Europe and Russia. Anyway, that's it.